They called me a gold digger. I should have told them the truth right then. But I didn't. That was my mistake. My name is Margaret, and at 58 years old, I thought I had learned enough about people to protect myself. I was wrong. When I met Richard at a charity book sale in Portland, Oregon, I wasn't looking for love. My first husband, Thomas, had passed away 6 years earlier, and I had made peace with the idea of growing old alone. But Richard was different, or so I thought. He was charming, well-read, and we spent hours discussing everything from classic literature to gardening. He didn't ask about my finances. He didn't seem to care that I lived in a modest apartment or drove a 12-year-old sedan. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet moment in his backyard with his golden retriever, Max, watching us with those knowing eyes dogs have. I said yes because I believed in second chances, because loneliness is a heavy thing to carry, and because Richard made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. The problem started the week we announced our engagement. Richard's son, Bradley, who was 34 and worked in real estate development, invited us to dinner at his house in the West Hills. The moment I walked through that door, I felt it. The cold assessment in his wife Vanessa's eyes as she took in my department store dress and simple jewelry. The way Bradley's smile didn't quite reach his eyes when he shook my hand. Dinner was uncomfortable. Vanessa made pointed comments about women who prey on lonely widowers. Bradley asked intrusive questions about my employment history, my savings, my late husband's estate. Richard tried to deflect, but he was weak in front of his son. I watched him shrink in that dining room, becoming smaller with every criticism Bradley leveled at him for rushing into things. "Dad," Bradley said, setting down his wine glass with more force than necessary, "you need a prenuptial agreement. I've already spoken to our family attorney." Richard's face went pale. "Bradley, that's not—" "It's necessary," Vanessa interrupted. She looked at me with undisguised contempt. "No offense, Margaret, but we have to protect Richard's assets. You understand, don't you? You wouldn't want people to think you're after his money." I understood perfectly. They had assessed me, found me lacking, and decided I was a threat to their inheritance. What they didn't know, what I chose not to tell them that night, was that Thomas and I had built something substantial during our 35 years together. My late husband had been a patent attorney, and we had invested wisely, very wisely. But after Thomas died, I had discovered something freeing about invisibility. I downsized, simplified my life, and enjoyed the quiet anonymity of being underestimated. I should have spoken up. I should have told Richard's family the truth. Instead, I made a decision that would change everything. I smiled and said, "Of course, a prenup makes perfect sense." Richard signed it 3 weeks later. The agreement was brutal in its simplicity. In the event of divorce, I would receive nothing. Not his house, not his retirement accounts, not even a portion of his late wife's jewelry that he had promised me. His attorney had made sure of that. What Richard didn't ask his attorney to include was any investigation into my assets. They assumed I had nothing worth protecting. We married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Bradley and Vanessa didn't attend. They sent a card with a check for $50, as if I were a service worker receiving a tip. Richard apologized for them constantly during our honeymoon in Cannon Beach, making excuses about Bradley's stress at work, Vanessa's difficult personality. I listened and said nothing, watching the waves and wondering when I would find the courage to tell him the truth. Life settled into a rhythm after we returned. I moved into Richard's 3-bedroom house in Beaverton. It was nice enough, though it needed updating. The kitchen cabinets were from the 1980s, the bathrooms had original pink tile, and the whole place had that musty smell of a home that had been lived in but not loved for too long. I didn't mind. I had lived in worse during my early years with Thomas, back when we were just starting out. What I did mind was Bradley and Vanessa's constant presence. They had keys to the house, a fact that Richard admitted sheepishly only after I found Vanessa in our kitchen one Tuesday morning, going through our mail. "I'm just checking to make sure Dad isn't being taken advantage of," she said, not even pretending to be embarrassed. "You don't mind, do you, Margaret?" I minded very much. But I was trying to make this marriage work, trying to give Richard space to establish boundaries with his son. So I smiled and offered her coffee, and watched as she rifled through our utility bills like she was searching for evidence of my crimes. The breaking point came 4 months into our marriage. I had invited my daughter, Caroline, to visit from Seattle. Caroline was a lawyer, sharp and protective of me in a way that sometimes felt suffocating. She had been against the marriage from the beginning, warning me that Richard seemed too good to be true. She was right, but not in the way she thought. Caroline arrived on a Friday evening in October. The leaves were turning, and there was that crisp smell of autumn in the air that always made me nostalgic. We were in the kitchen making dinner when Bradley and Vanessa showed up unannounced. Again. "Dad's not feeling well," Bradley announced, brushing past me without greeting. "I'm taking him to urgent care." Richard did look pale, sitting in his recliner in the living room. "I'm fine," he protested weakly. "Just a headache." "You're going to the doctor," Bradley insisted. Then he turned to me. "You stay here with your daughter. We don't need you getting in the way." Caroline's fork clattered against her plate. "Excuse me?" "I said, we don't need her," Bradley repeated, his tone making it clear that her was me. "This is family business." I put my hand on Caroline's arm before she could respond. "It's fine, honey. Let them go." But it wasn't fine. Caroline waited exactly 3 minutes after they left before exploding. "Mom, how can you let them treat you like this? You're his wife." "I know," I said quietly. "Then why are you acting like some poor relation they're tolerating out of charity?" She paced the kitchen, her anger making her movements sharp. "This is insane. You could buy and sell Bradley's entire real estate portfolio without breaking a sweat, and you're letting him talk to you like you're Caroline." My voice was firm enough to stop her mid-sentence. "I need to handle this my way." "Your way isn't working, Mom." She sat down heavily. "When are you going to tell Richard the truth about the properties?" The properties. That's what Caroline called them. What she meant was the 12 commercial buildings in Portland's Pearl District that Thomas and I had purchased in the early 1990s, back when that area was full of warehouses and nobody wanted them. We had seen the potential, invested everything we had, and held on through the lean years. Now those buildings were worth approximately $18 million. The rental income alone was more than Richard made in 5 years. "I'll tell him when the time is right," I said. "When is that exactly? When Bradley has you sign away your rights to your own property? When Vanessa has you doing their laundry?" She had a point. The situation had become untenable. I was living a lie, and that lie was making me smaller every day. I had thought that Richard would defend me, that love would be enough. But Richard was too accustomed to appeasing his son, and I was tired of waiting for him to grow a spine. The decision was made for me the following Tuesday. I received a call from my property manager, David, about a potential buyer interested in one of the buildings. A tech company wanted to lease the entire structure for their headquarters, a deal that would net me $600,000 a year for the next 10 years. David needed my approval to move forward with negotiations. "I'll come to your office tomorrow to review the paperwork," I told him. Richard overheard. We were in the living room, and he looked up from his newspaper with mild curiosity. "What paperwork?" This was it. This was the moment to tell him. But before I could speak, the doorbell rang. Bradley and Vanessa, of course. They had brought dinner, which meant they wanted something. What they wanted, as it turned out, was money. "Dad, I need to borrow $20,000, Bradley said, not even waiting until we had finished the takeout Chinese food he had brought. "It's for a property development deal. The returns will be substantial." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Son, I don't have that kind of cash just lying around. What about your retirement account? You could take an early withdrawal." Bradley's eyes flicked to me, then away. "Unless you've already given it to Margaret for her shopping sprees." I had been silent through dinner, as I usually was during these family visits. But something in Bradley's tone, the casual cruelty of it, made something inside me snap. "I don't need Richard's money," I said quietly. Vanessa laughed. "Of course you don't. You have your own, right? What is it, Margaret? A few thousand in a savings account? Maybe a small life insurance policy from your first husband?" "Vanessa," Richard said, his voice pained. "That's not—" "It's 18 million, I said. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that worn carpet. Bradley spoke first. "What? $18 million, I repeated, my voice steady now. "That's the approximate value of the commercial properties I own in the Pearl District. The rental income is around $2.3 million per year, though it fluctuates with vacancies and lease renewals. Richard's face had gone from pale to gray. Margaret, what are you talking about? I turned to my husband, this man I had married hoping for companionship in my later years, and felt a wave of sadness wash over me. I own 12 buildings in downtown Portland. My late husband and I purchased them in the 90s. I've been managing them since he passed away. That's impossible, Vanessa sputtered. You live in a tiny apartment. You drive that old car. You dress like… She stopped herself, but the implication was clear. I dress like someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, I finished for her. After Thomas died, I realized I didn't want the big house, the expensive clothes, the shallow friendships based on net worth. I wanted simplicity, peace. I looked at Richard. I wanted to meet someone who would love me for who I am, not what I have. Bradley had recovered enough to be angry. You lied to us. I never lied, I said. You assumed, and I didn't correct you. There's a difference. Dad, she's been hiding assets. Bradley turned to Richard, his face flushed. The prenup is invalid if she concealed wealth. Our attorney can. The prenup only addresses Richard's assets, I interrupted. I had my own attorney review it. It says nothing about my property because you never asked. You were so certain I had nothing that it never occurred to you to include a clause about my finances. Richard still hadn't spoken. He sat there, staring at me like I was a stranger, and perhaps I was. Perhaps we had never really known each other at all. Why didn't you tell me? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to, I said truthfully. Every day, I wanted to. But then Bradley would make some comment about gold diggers, or Vanessa would inspect my clothes like she was checking for designer labels, and I would think, why? Why should I prove myself to people who had already decided who I was? But I'm not Bradley, Richard said. I'm your husband. Are you? The question hung in the air between us. Because from where I'm sitting, you've let your son treat me like a charity case for 4 months. You've stood by while Vanessa went through our personal mail. You've apologized for them, excused them, but you've never once defended me. Vanessa found her voice. This is manipulation. She was testing us, seeing if we were good enough for her and her money. No, I said firmly. I was hoping you would see me. Just me. Margaret. A woman who likes to read, who volunteers at the library, who makes terrible jokes and cries at dog food commercials. But all you could see was what you thought I didn't have. Bradley stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Come on, Dad, we're leaving. You can't stay married to someone who's been lying to you this whole time. I waited for Richard to defend me, to tell his son that I hadn't lied, that his own assumptions had created this mess. But Richard just sat there, looking lost and old and confused. I think you should leave, I said to Bradley and Vanessa. This is between Richard and me now. You can't kick us out of Dad's house, Vanessa said. Actually, I can. Richard, you should know that your prenup protects your assets in case of divorce, but it doesn't specify living arrangements during the marriage. As your wife, I have every right to ask guests to leave. They went, but not without slamming doors and making threats about lawyers. When the house was finally quiet, Richard and I sat across from each other in the living room, the remains of our interrupted dinner growing cold on the coffee table. I need time to think, Richard said eventually. Take all the time you need, I replied. He went to bed early. I stayed up, sitting in the dark living room, wondering how we had arrived at this point. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Did you tell him? I didn't respond. The next morning, Richard asked me to move out. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply said, over coffee and toast that neither of us ate, that he couldn't be married to someone he didn't really know, that the foundation of our relationship had been built on a false premise, that he needed space to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Bradley thinks we should separate for a while, he added. And those 6 words told me everything I needed to know. Bradley was still making the decisions. I had just become a problem to be managed. Fine, I said. I'll be out by the weekend. You don't have to rush. Yes, I do. I stood up, leaving my untouched breakfast on the table. Because if I stay here one more day while you figure out whether your son's opinion matters more than your marriage, I'm going to say things we can't come back from. I packed my things that afternoon. It didn't take long. I hadn't brought much when I moved in, and I was taking even less when I left. As I loaded my car, I saw the curtain twitch in the neighbor's window. Mrs. Chen, watching the drama unfold. Let her watch. Let them all watch. I drove to a hotel downtown, checked in for a week, and called my attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had handled my affairs since Thomas died. She listened to my story without interruption, then said exactly what I expected. File for divorce. Today. I don't want his money, I told her. I know. But you want your dignity. File the paperwork. Let him see what it feels like to be the one blindsided. I did. The papers were served to Richard 3 days later, exactly 72 hours after he had asked me to leave. Bradley called me screaming about how I was trying to steal his father's house, his retirement, his life savings. I hung up on him. Vanessa left a voicemail calling me things I won't repeat. I deleted it without listening to the end. Richard himself didn't call for a week. When he finally did, his voice was small. Margaret, can we talk, please? Talk, I said. I made a mistake. I should have trusted you. I should have defended you to Bradley and Vanessa. I should have. You should have treated me like your wife instead of an inconvenient puzzle you couldn't solve, I interrupted. But you didn't. I want to fix this. He sounded desperate now. Please, let me try to fix this. Richard, did you know that one of my tenants is a restaurant that just won a James Beard Award? They've been in one of my buildings for 8 years. When they started, they were broke culinary school graduates with a dream. I gave them a break on the rent for the first year. Now they're successful, and they've never missed a payment. I paused. Do you know why I'm telling you this? No, he admitted. Because in 8 years of being their landlord, they have never once asked me for a favor I couldn't give, or made me prove I deserved their respect. You've known me for less than 2 years, and you've done both. I felt tears starting, but I pushed them back. I don't want your apologies. I don't want your explanations. I want to go back to being the person I was before I met you, the person who didn't have to justify her existence. Please, he said, and there was real pain in his voice. I love you. You love the idea of me, I corrected gently. The woman you thought I was. Quiet, undemanding, grateful for your attention. But you don't love Margaret, the woman who built an empire with her first husband, who makes decisions about millions of dollars, who has her own life that doesn't revolve around your approval. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked. When have you ever asked about my work? My interests? My life before you? You were happy to have a companion who didn't challenge you, who didn't make demands. But the moment you found out I was more than what you assumed, you asked me to leave. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he had hung up. Finally, he said, "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," I said honestly. "I don't want anything from you, Richard. That's what you never understood. I never needed your money, your house, your status. I just wanted you." I hung up before he could respond. The divorce took 6 months to finalize. Richard contested it at first, urged on by Bradley, who was convinced I was going to take everything. But Patricia reminded him, through his attorney, that the prenup he had insisted on protected his assets entirely. I was asking for nothing. Not the house, not the retirement accounts, not even the jewelry he had promised me. The only thing I wanted was my freedom, and I got it. The day the divorce was final, I drove past Richard's house in Beaverton. There was a for sale sign in the front yard. I felt a pang of something, not quite regret, but maybe sadness for what might have been if things had been different. If Richard had been stronger. If Bradley had been kinder. But I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached the Pearl District, where I met David at the building the tech company wanted to lease. We walked through the empty floors together, discussing improvements and build-out costs. When we were done, David handed me the lease agreement to sign. $600,000 a year, he said, shaking his head. Thomas would be proud. Yes, I agreed. He would. I signed the paperwork sitting on the floor of what would soon be someone's dream office, using David's back as a hard surface because we hadn't thought to bring a clipboard. It was undignified and perfect, and I laughed for the first time in months. That evening, I had dinner with Caroline at a small Italian restaurant near my new condo. I had bought it the week after Richard asked me to leave, a 2-bedroom place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. It was beautiful and modern and entirely mine. "Mom," Caroline said, raising her wine glass. "To new beginnings, to new beginnings," I echoed. "So what now?" she asked. "Are you going to date again? Join a book club? Take up skydiving?" I smiled. "I'm going to do something I should have done a long time ago." "What's that?" "I'm going to stop pretending to be less than I am just to make other people comfortable." I set down my glass. "And I'm going to establish a scholarship fund in Thomas's name. For kids from low-income families who want to study law or business." I've been thinking about it for years, but I kept putting it off. "No more putting things off." Caroline reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Dad would love that." "I think so too." 3 months later, I saw Richard at a charity event. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked older, more tired. He was with a woman about my age, and they seemed comfortable together in that way people do when they're just starting to know each other. She was laughing at something he said, and he had that same charming smile I had fallen for. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. The woman with him followed his gaze and whispered something. He nodded and started walking toward me. I could have left. I could have pretended I didn't see him. But I stayed. "Margaret," he said when he reached me. "You look well." "Thank you, so do you." Awkward silence. Then, "I heard about your scholarship fund. It's a generous thing. Thomas would have wanted it." More silence. The woman he had been with was watching us with curious eyes from across the room. "I owe you an apology," Richard said finally. "A real one, not the ones I gave you when I was trying to fix what I had broken." "Okay," I said simply. "I was a coward. I let my son's fears become my fears, and I let them poison what we had. You deserved better than that. You deserved better than me." "Yes," I agreed. "I did." He winced, but nodded. "I hope you find what you're looking for." "I already have," I told him. "I found myself again. That's worth more than any relationship that requires me to diminish who I am." He opened his mouth, closed it, then just nodded. "Goodbye, Margaret. Goodbye, Richard." I watched him walk back to his date, and I felt nothing. No anger, no regret, no lingering affection. Just a quiet sense of peace. That night, I sat in my condo looking out at the city lights reflected in the river. My phone buzzed with an email from the scholarship committee. They had selected their first recipients, 5 students who would have their full tuition paid for 4 years. 5 lives changed because I had finally stopped hiding my light under a bushel, as my mother used to say. They called me a gold digger. They were wrong. I wasn't after anyone's gold. I had my own, earned through hard work and smart investments and a marriage built on true partnership with Thomas. What I had been after was something much simpler and much more precious. Respect, understanding, love that didn't require me to be smaller than I was. I didn't get it from Richard, but in the end, I got something better. I got myself back. And at 59 years old, sitting in a condo I bought with my own money, watching the city I had helped build through my investments, I realized that was more than enough. It was everything.